The Sunny Pines HOA stole my grandfather's land to build 96 luxury homes. But when I uncovered his 110-year-old property surveys, their entire development, including 20 existing houses, legally became mine. What I did next left their entire board speechless. I never imagined I'd have to fight for dirt that's been in my family for generations. But Grandpa Joe left me one final gift, and it wasn't just land. It was a trap. I first learned something was wrong at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, one of those phone calls that sets your heart pounding before you even pick up. The voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Thompson, my grandfather's next-door neighbor and a steady presence in my childhood summers. She was so agitated that I could hardly make sense of her words. All I caught were, "They're digging, and houses, and your land." I kept trying to calm her, but a tremor in her voice told me she wasn't exaggerating. Mrs. Thompson had lived beside my grandfather's farm for over 40 years, longer than I'd been alive. She knew every fence post, every footpath, every boundary marker better than anyone except Grandpa Joe himself. If she said someone was building houses on my inherited farmland, there had to be truth to it. By 7:30, I'd thrown enough clothes into a duffel bag to last a few days, left a rushed voicemail from my boss saying I had an emergency, and jumped into my old pickup. Normally, the drive from my city apartment to Meadow Creek took a little over 6 hours, but I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, ignoring the coffee I desperately wanted and the rising tension in my shoulders. Every mile felt heavier than the last. When I finally turned onto the dirt road leading to the farm, my stomach knotted. Clouds of dust billowed in the distance, and I could hear the low roar of bulldozers before the farmhouse even came into view. The orchard my grandfather planted years ago still stood to the west, the rows of fruit trees a comforting sight. But to the east, the land was carved up with bright orange spray paint and deep trenches. People in hard hats shuffled around, marking territory like an invading army. It was surreal. This place was my legacy, passed down through 4 generations, originally settled by my great-great-grandparents, who had braved wild storms and financial hardships to keep the land intact. Grandpa Joe, the last caretaker before it fell to me, had been clear in his wishes. "Never sell, Alex. This dirt is in our veins." I spotted a tall woman in crisp beige pants and a pristine blouse, standing off to the side with a clipboard. She barely flinched when I walked up, as if strangers confronting her was part of the job. She finished a quick call on her phone, lowered it, and regarded me with the poised, polite distance of someone used to being in charge. "Hello," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" I kept my voice level. "I'm Alex Morgan. My grandfather was Joe Miller. This is my land. Can you tell me why bulldozers are tearing up the fields?" Her name turned out to be Diane Reynolds, president of the Sunny Pines HOA, an organization I'd never heard of until that very moment. Her explanation was a miracle of polished deflection. "We have all permits. The land was purchased. Your grandfather must have signed the sale." Each phrase sounded rote, rehearsed. "My grandfather never sold anything to you," I insisted, a spike of anger creeping into my tone. "He passed away a few months ago and I inherited everything. I never got so much as a phone call about any sale." Diane offered an exaggerated shrug and handed me a business card with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "There must be a misunderstanding. Feel free to contact our legal department. But we've been planning this development for years. Work started yesterday. We have a schedule to keep." She turned her back on me without another word, phone already at her ear again. A couple of workers glanced in our direction, uneasy expressions on their faces. I stood in stunned silence, the roar of machinery reminding me that this wasn't some minor trespass. They were forging ahead as if they owned the place. I couldn't figure out how any of this could have happened. Grandpa Joe had been ill, yes, but his mind was sharp right up until the end. Selling the farm, the land he was so proud of, just didn't fit. Something was obviously wrong. Mrs. Thompson found me on the farmhouse porch not long after that. She came by with iced tea, her hands trembling as she set down the pitcher. "Your grandpa kept saying they were trying to steal from him," she told me, voice wavering with emotion. "He was in no condition to fight, but he swore he wouldn't sign away anything." I nodded numbly, exhaustion catching up with me. The inside of the farmhouse was musty and quiet, exactly as I'd left it when I came down for the funeral. Family photographs lined the walls, dusty from neglect. My heart clenched. Grandpa Joe's absence had a physical weight here, like a missing beam in an old barn. That same evening, I ventured into his study, a cramped room at the back of the house that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were filled with old farm logs, crop rotation plans, and budget notebooks meticulously kept over decades. Grandpa had a system, everything labeled by year, cross-referenced in a ledger for quick retrieval. He was borderline obsessive about record-keeping. The first few hours yielded nothing but an acute sense of loss. Every folder I touched reminded me of summers spent tagging along behind him in the fields, listening to stories about how the family first settled here. The only sign of anything about a sale were receipts for seeds, hardware supplies, or fuel for the tractor. No deeds transferred, no major transactions. My eyes were burning by the time I noticed a slight gap in the floorboards under his desk. When I pressed my foot on it, the wood shifted, a hidden compartment. My pulse kicked up. I pried it open, carefully sliding a letter opener underneath. Inside was a small metal box, locked. Fortunately, the key hung from a tiny nail hammered into the desk's underside, probably an old farmer's trick to keep valuables hidden. The contents of that box changed everything. There was Grandpa Joe's will, naming me as heir. A set of yellowed, brittle surveys from 1910. Another survey from 1978 that looked official and recognized by the county. And finally, a letter in Grandpa's handwriting, addressed to me. My hands shook as I read his words. Alex, if you've found this, someone's trying to take what's ours. I never signed my land away. Compare these old surveys to what's on record now. They've changed our boundaries. It's wrong, but you can prove it. He mentioned how some developers had come sniffing around, pressuring him for a quick sale, but he wrote that a man from Sunny Pines kept showing up with different papers about road access, always pushing for a signature. Grandpa grew suspicious when each document contradicted the last. Then I saw it. The original farmland boundaries extended much farther east than I'd realized. It wasn't just a few acres. We were talking about 80, maybe more, that somehow vanished from current records. Based on Grandpa's notes, that missing land stretched well into where Sunny Pines' first set of luxury homes stood. If Grandpa's records were correct, then a big chunk of their existing community was on farmland that never legally left our family. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, I marched straight to Walter Franklin, the only property lawyer in Meadow Creek who had a reputation for tackling tough cases. He was older than I expected, wore a bow tie that seemed 3 decades out of style, and had eyes that gleamed whenever something piqued his interest. As soon as Walter saw the 1910 and 1978 surveys, his brows rose so high I thought they'd disappear into his hairline. You're telling me the new records cut out about 80 acres from your family's property, he confirmed, tapping the older documents. That's not a tiny oversight, it's major. I nodded. It seems that way, especially since the farmland boundary was consistent for decades, until some suspicious changes started popping up in county records around 1984. Then, in 1997, an even bigger shift quietly occurred. Signatures are questionable. I've got Grandpa's diaries and medical records. He was in the hospital the month he supposedly signed. Walter laced his fingers together, leaning back in his chair. You can't just waltz into the new development and demand everyone vacate. But if these documents are valid, we're talking fraud at a massive scale. He wasted no time filing for an emergency injunction, something to stop the ongoing construction on the farmland until the matter was settled. The local judge, likely uneasy about the potential scandal, granted it within a day. When I took that injunction to the construction site, workers were packing up for the night. Diane Reynolds waited by her black SUV, tapping her foot impatiently. She read the papers, her face darkening. This is ridiculous, she muttered, scanning the official stamp and the judge's signature. Fraudulently altering boundary lines is more than ridiculous, I countered. It's illegal, and I have every intention of proving what you and your associates did. Diane's expression hardened. Her voice dropped to a near whisper that carried more threat than any shout. By tomorrow, your farm will have 15 code violations. How long until you can't afford the fines? Or the accidents? I stiffened. That sounds like intimidation. She offered a cold little smile. A friendly heads up, dear. We can make your life very difficult if you persist. We've done all the paperwork. The county commissioner is a personal friend. You're out of your depth. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing my hands shake. My grandfather believed in fighting for what's ours. So do I. Her parting words drifted over her shoulder as she climbed into the SUV. You have no clue who you're dealing with. That night, I realized something else. Grandpa Joe must have known all along there'd come a time when this fight was inevitable. His letter mentioned that the truth is in boundaries. He'd laid out the trap well. All I had to do was walk the path he'd left. Sure enough, early the next morning, a county inspector appeared out of nowhere. He wrote up citations for the farmhouse roof, the barn's wiring, and even the porch railing height. 3 official notices in half an hour. Then the water company called about maintenance issues on my line. My water would be shut off for an indefinite period. Sunset brought new harassment, a text from an unknown number claiming I owed a parking violation fine of $500 for having my own truck on Sunny Pines common area. The photo attached showed my driveway. My stomach twisted at the realization. These people were dangerously brazen. When I sought help, I kept hitting dead ends. The sheriff's department told me it was a civil matter. The county offices were run by people who were either incompetent or in Sunny Pines' pocket. But Grandpa's old documents were too strong to ignore forever, and that gave me hope. In the meantime, I started digging deeper into the Sunny Pines development. Public records, tax filings, LLC registrations. Patterns began to emerge. The same handful of names controlling multiple companies, funneling money from one account to another. Diane's husband, Thomas Reynolds, was listed as an officer in at least 3 shell corporations. Another big name was James Harris, the county commissioner, and Mark Wilson, the planning board director, seemed to have green-lit every expansion request that Sunny Pines submitted. A helpful discovery came when I visited the Meadow Creek Gazette. Its editor, Tanya Williams, had known my grandfather back in the day. She was intrigued but cautious. "I can't run a story unless you have solid proof," she said. "Accusing powerful officials in a small town is a dangerous game." I left with a promise from her. If I dug up anything concrete tying these officials to fraud, she'd publish it. Just after that meeting, I ran into Mr. Grayson, another longtime resident. He told me how the HOA had basically harassed him into selling his home for below market value. They'd fine me for everything. Grass too high, mailbox shape not approved, until I was buried in fees. And who do you pay? The HOA. Who controls the HOA? Diane's circle. More pieces fell into place as multiple neighbors shared stories of forced compliance, suspicious fines, and intimidation. Then came the text from my attorney, Walter. "Injunction granted. Hearing next week. Brace yourself." I returned to the site that evening, brandishing the injunction papers to the on-site manager. It halted the bulldozers, but we both knew it was temporary. I saw Diane standing off to the side, phone against her ear. When she noticed me, she mimed a slow, sarcastic clap. That unspoken message was clear: congratulations. This changes nothing. Later that night, I locked myself in Grandpa's study. Exhausted, I read through a second stash of diaries I found in the same hidden box. Inside was a trove of details. Phone calls Grandpa had logged, suspicious events he'd recorded, people who approached him to buy the land, plus older documents referencing the wetlands that border the east side of the farm. These wetlands, Grandpa wrote, were a crucial part of the area's ecosystem, protecting the region from flooding and housing endangered species. He'd apparently used those wetlands as leverage in previous attempts by outside companies to build there. Now, I wondered if I could do the same. If Sunny Pines had illegally swallowed acreage that included those protected wetlands, it wouldn't just be a local property dispute, it could escalate into federal violations. At dawn, I reached out to an environmental group Grandpa had scribbled about in his diaries. They sent a field biologist, who confirmed the wetlands were indeed home to at least 3 threatened species. That knowledge felt like a hidden ace up my sleeve. Meanwhile, Diane decided to go on the offensive. She called for a community meeting at the Sunny Pines clubhouse to discuss the matter of a fraudulent claim against the HOA. I heard about it through a neighbor and decided to make an appearance, uninvited. The clubhouse was packed with homeowners in neat rows of metal folding chairs, glossy pamphlets about Sunny Pines East on every seat. Diane was at the front, describing how some unscrupulous individual is attempting to claim our land. The room quieted as I walked straight to the front, a folder on. Standing there, facing nearly 100 residents, I felt a sudden pang of guilt. Not everyone in that room was a villain. Some just wanted a nice place to live. Some had invested life savings in a dream home. The conflict pitted me, a stranger in their eyes, against their entire community. Diane froze for only a second, then fixed her bright red blazer and tried to dismiss me. "We'll take questions at the end." I cleared my throat, raising my voice so it carried. "I think you all deserve to hear this now. My name is Alex Morgan. My grandfather was Joe Miller, who owned this farmland for decades, land that's still legally in my family. But somewhere along the line, those boundaries got erased from public records. The documents I have here show the original lines, recognized by the county as far back as 1910. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few people stared at Diane, then at me, not sure what to believe. She sputtered something about fabricated papers. I continued, unwavering. This means about 80 acres of what you think is Sunny Pines might still belong to the Miller family. That includes the site where you plan to build 96 new luxury homes and possibly some existing homes too. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as confusion and fear spread. A man in the back hollered, "That's impossible. I already have a mortgage on one of those lots." Another voice piped up, "We were told everything was approved by the county." Diane's face flushed, and she tried to regain control. "All right, that's enough. This individual is trying to sabotage our community. Please exit the clubhouse if you've come here to disrupt." Some started to leave in alarm, but a woman I'd never met before, Rachel Winters, I later learned, raised her hand. "I just put my entire life savings into an upcoming build. Is my new house on stolen land?" That question snapped the tension. People realized the seriousness of what was at stake. Diane ended the meeting abruptly, ordering everyone out under some technique. She threatened to call security if I didn't leave. But the damage was done. I could see it in the alarmed expressions of folks who had wholeheartedly believed they were on solid ground. Back at the farmhouse, I fell into a restless sleep, only to be awakened around midnight by headlights sweeping across the yard. 3 white SUVs with Sunny Pines security logos parked in a line at the end of my driveway, effectively blocking me from leaving. One of the security men handed me a thick envelope with a cease and desist from the HOA. Inside it, they accused me of forging documents and demanded I pay for damages to the community's reputation. They also set up huge concrete blocks across the driveway. "This access point is closed for safety reasons," one guard drawled. I realized how easily power can be abused in a small town where everything is intertwined. At dawn, I called the sheriff's office again, only to be rebuffed. "It's a civil matter, sir. Take it to the courts." A wave of despair crashed over me. I felt entirely alone and outmatched. Pinned in place, literally unable to leave without climbing over farmland in my old truck, if that was even feasible. But that same morning, an unlikely ally arrived. Gerald Fisher, the HOA treasurer I recognized from the disastrous community meeting, drove carefully around the concrete blocks and knocked on my door. He clutched a flash drive in his hand like it was contraband. "I shouldn't be here," he began, glancing nervously over his shoulder at the security SUVs. "If Diane finds out, she'll destroy me. But this is bigger than my fear of her." He showed me the HOA's financials, including questionable transactions funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into consulting and maintenance companies that turned out to be owned by Diane's relatives. "This is where your high fines and special assessments go," Gerald explained. "Diane and her circle are siphoning off the community's money." I was torn between outrage and relief. Finally, something of Diane's corruption. "We can use this," I told him. "Thank you." He nodded with a kind of grim determination. "What you're doing is right. There are a lot of decent folks in Sunny Pines who can't stand her regime, if there's anything I can do." At that, I had an idea. Grandpa Joe had always said the best way to beat bullies was to unite the people they oppressed. So I spent the rest of that day visiting every neighbor I could. I heard stories from families battered by arbitrary HOA fines, elderly couples forced to remove backyard flower beds for not matching community guidelines, and single parents threatened with liens for minor violations. On each porch, I carefully showed them copies of Grandpa's surveys, explained the fraud, and revealed how Diane was bleeding the HOA for personal gain. The response was overwhelming. Some cried tears of frustration, relieved that someone was finally standing up to her. Others bristled with anger, ready to fight. We decided to call an emergency meeting of our own at the Meadow Creek Community Center. Word spread quickly. Diane, predictably, tried to block it, but we discovered that the land under the community center was actually part of the acreage in question, making me, in all likelihood, the rightful owner. That meant she had no authority to stop us. The day of the meeting, I printed flyers reading, "Your home may be at risk. Join the fight to protect our community." A sense of purpose fueled me as I drove around, sliding the notices under doors. I could almost imagine Grandpa Joe's approving nod. That evening, the place was filled to capacity. Neighbors of all ages, reporters from the local paper, even folks from the next county over who'd heard rumors of corruption at Sunny Pines. Nervous energy crackled in the air. People whispered among themselves, some uncertain, others clearly furious. After we opened the floor, story after story poured out. Seniors harassed over mailbox sizes, families threatened with eviction for painting shutters the wrong shade of blue, hidden fees that tripled over a 5-year span. I stood at the front, listening with a mixture of sadness and resolve. When the moment felt right, I cleared my throat. "This isn't just about me," I said, projecting my voice so it carried to the back of the room. "It's about all of us who've been bullied, scammed, or silenced by an HOA that overstepped every moral line. I'm proposing we form a new association, one with fair rules, transparent governance, and real community spirit. We'll call it the Meadow Creek Homeowners Coalition, and we'll file a formal complaint against Diane's HOA for fraud, mismanagement, and harassment." Diane, who had slipped quietly into the back row, charged forward at that, practically shaking with fury. "You don't have the authority," she spat, voice quivering. "Those homes are bound by contract to Sunny Pines. You can't just walk in and change that." I held up the 1910 survey. "You're the one who doesn't have authority. You built on land you don't own, financed by banks using property that was never yours to begin with. Contracts based on fraudulent boundaries aren't legally binding. Once the courts confirm these original surveys, we can renegotiate everything." There were scattered cheers. Diane tried to retort, but a retired schoolteacher in the front row stood up. "We're tired of your threats, Ms. Reynolds. My granddaughter couldn't even visit my house without you issuing a noise violation." Applause and shouts erupted. Diane glared daggers at me, then at Gerald Fisher, who was filming the entire event with his phone. "By this time tomorrow," she hissed, pointing a finger at me, "you'll regret ever coming back to Meadow Creek." She stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled. A hush followed, broken by a neighbor clearing his throat. "What do we do if she cuts our power or water again?" "Stick together," I said firmly. "She can't shut off everyone at once. The more we stand as one, the less control she has." By the end of the night, nearly 90 families had signed on to join our new coalition. It was an incredible moment of unity, reminiscent of how small towns used to stand shoulder to shoulder in times of hardship. We had momentum on our side. Predictably, Diane struck back fast. The next morning, half the houses in Sunny Pines discovered notices taped to their doors, code violations, warnings of fines, or immediate demands to remove non-compliant structures. But this time, instead of cowering, they called each other, took photos, and shared everything with me and with the local newspaper. That's when the big break happened. Tanya Williams, the Gazette editor, ran a front-page story titled, "HOA Bullies and Fraud Allegations. Is Sunny Pines built on stolen land?" She cited the historical surveys, our interviews, and witness accounts. It caused an uproar. Local TV news crews came sniffing around. So did the state attorney general's office. And the final blow landed 2 days later, when an environmental survey, ordered at my request, confirmed that the wetlands behind the farmland were protected by federal law. Not only were Diane and her cronies operating on fraudulent land, they were building in an ecologically sensitive zone that required special permits never obtained. Around the same time, a police cruiser appeared at my grandfather's farmhouse. Stepping out was Police Chief Williams, looking decidedly uneasy, alongside a county records clerk named Carolyn Mitchell. With them was Diane Reynolds, face set in a tight scowl. "You're trespassing on private property," the chief began, then paused as I handed him a folder. "This is the original deed," I said calmly, "plus the official surveys we recovered, verified by 2 independent surveyors. It shows the land is mine." Carolyn Mitchell nodded. "We did a preliminary check of older archives. It matches these documents." She set them on the hood of the cruiser and flipped through them. The boundary changes in 1973 and again in 1997 appear unsubstantiated by any valid signature. There's strong evidence the signatures were forged. Diane snatched at the papers, but the chief pressed a hand gently against her arm to stop her. His expression darkened further when I slid over Gerald Fisher's flash drive. "These are the HOA's financial records," I explained. "More than $400,000 unaccounted for, funneling through companies owned by Miss Reynolds' relatives." The chief glanced at Diane. "Miss Reynolds, I think you'd better come down to the station." She stiffened, flipping her hair back. "This is preposterous. My husband plays golf with the judge. I'll have your badge for this." But the chief's face remained impassive. "We'll see what the courts say." Within hours, Diane was booked on suspicion of fraud and embezzlement. She posted bails, but the damage to her iron grip on Sunny Pines was done. We still had the enormous question of what to do about the families who had bought lots or built houses on what was clearly my land. I called another public meeting, this time at the high school auditorium, the only place large enough. There, in front of a crowd even bigger than before, I made my announcement: "I don't intend to evict anyone. The farmland and the existing homes can coexist. But from this day forward, we operate under the Meadow Creek Homeowners Coalition. We will protect the wetlands Grandpa Joe cared about. We will revise the boundaries accurately, and no one will pay arbitrary fines. If you want to keep your home, sign on to this new association and commit to fair rules. Questions flew from every corner. One man was worried about losing his investment in a partially built house. Another family had concerns about mortgage contracts. I reassured them that we'd work with lenders to properly record the new property lines. The point was to fix a broken system, not punish innocent people. Over the following 6 months, we hammered out a massive legal settlement. Banks reissued titles for dozens of properties, referencing corrected boundaries. Those who wanted refunds for incomplete builds got them. Others swapped lots to preserve the wetlands. The county commissioner, James Harris, faced his own investigation for conflict of interest, especially after additional evidence linked him to Sunny Pines shell companies. Mark Wilson, head of the planning board, stepped down, likely to avoid criminal charges. Diane, for her part, tried to fight back in the courts, but with the environmental violations plus the financial wrongdoing, she had little leverage. She ended up taking a plea deal to avoid a lengthy prison sentence, though it included a hefty fine and restitution to many of the homeowners she had duped. 1 year later, I'm sitting on the porch of Grandpa Joe's farmhouse, which we renovated into a welcoming community center for the reimagined Meadow Creek. Instead of bulldozers, I hear kids laughing on their bikes, rolling down the freshly paved paths that wind through smaller, eco-friendly homes. The wetlands remain untouched, protected by a legal easement. A group of neighbors are planting native flowers along the creek edge, turning what could have been a sterile subdivision into a place where wildlife and people thrive together. Mrs. Thompson settles next to me with 2 glasses of lemonade, looking out at the fields that once lay in dusty ruin. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she says softly. "He always talked about keeping the land in the family, but I think he'd be even prouder seeing you protect it the way you did." She's right. In the end, it wasn't just about ownership. It was about honoring Grandpa Joe's legacy, his belief that good land deserves good caretakers, and that people can come together to stand up for what's right. As for Diane, she lost her position, her cozy relationship with local officials, and the fear-based power she wielded over ordinary people. The last I heard, she was trying to sell her mansion in the original Sunny Pines development, the one that, ironically, sits on land my grandfather never intended to part with. When I think back to those 110-year-old surveys hidden under the desk, I can't help but smile. Grandpa Joe knew exactly what he was doing. He anticipated every move they'd make. He left behind documents and diaries, meticulously laying out the truth that no dishonest scheme could bury forever. I walk to the edge of the porch and look out over the farmland. The fields are rich and green under the afternoon sun, perfect row upon row of corn swaying in a gentle breeze. And just beyond, I see the reflection of the wetlands that have become a sanctuary for blue herons, river otters, and countless other creatures. In the distance, neighbors are chatting, children are playing, and there's a sense of warmth that radiates from this community. It's a far cry from the fear-laden environment Diane once presided over. Now, a new association sets fair regulations, invests in real improvements, and holds open meetings with honest bookkeeping. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing by not simply kicking everyone off my land. The easy route would have been to take a massive settlement and disappear, but the older I get, the more I realize that land isn't just a commodity. It holds our stories, our history, and the potential for future generations to flourish. Grandpa Joe understood that, so I stay here, living in the old farmhouse, making it a meeting place for neighbors, a space for gatherings, a hub of real community, and every so often, I'll find one more hidden note or scribbled map left behind by Grandpa Joe, as if he's still guiding me forward. He set the trap all right, though not the kind Diane probably imagined. His trap wasn't about ensnaring people in legalities. It was about revealing truth and forcing them to confront their own corruption. Like any good trap, it ended up capturing exactly the right prey. Where once there were bullies and crooks, now there's a neighborhood revived by cooperation and unity. The farmland remains in my name, yes, but it also belongs to everyone who works to keep it alive and thriving. In a way, Grandpa Joe's final gift was never just the property lines or the paperwork. It was the principle that some things, family legacies, open skies, and honest living, cannot be stolen no matter how hard some might try. The Sunny Pines HOA learned that lesson the hard way. They tried to steal land that wasn't theirs, but they ended up giving me the chance to make this place better than ever. And I think Grandpa Joe, in his infinite wisdom, knew from the start that the only way to protect the land he loved was to let those who care about it stand together. Sometimes, the best way to set a trap isn't to ambush someone from the shadows. It's to shine a light so bright that everyone can see what's really going on, and leave the guilty with no path of escape except facing the truth. And that truth, in the end, is that the farmland never really belonged to them. It belonged to Grandpa Joe, to our family, and now to a community that respects what he fought for. A family farm outside Meadow Creek might not seem like much in a world of bigger and bigger developments, but as I watch that blue heron lift off from the wetlands and glide over the rooftops, it feels like the most precious piece of earth on the planet.